The homily is based on John chapter 6, verses 51 to 58. Many of you in church today have had the experience of holding down a very demanding job. Perhaps it requires you to work long hours of long overtime. Perhaps it cuts into evening hours and weekends. Perhaps it carries with it a lot of stress, and it's very difficult for you to leave it behind when you go home from work. Perhaps you've even found yourself wondering whether you have any other life at all apart from going to work. I've heard people talk about that. I have said that. They'll be lamenting the fact that their job takes up so much of their time, and they say, I really need to get a life. The truth is that we all understand instinctively what they mean. We understand that it is possible to be alive in a physical sense, but still not be experiencing real life. What Jesus once referred to as life in all its fullness, or abundant life. We understand that people can be in good health, can be working hard and enjoying success in their chosen profession, and yet still find themselves thinking, there must be more to life than this. In John chapter 6, Jesus talks about the issue of real life, or as he calls it, eternal life. We've been going through the chapter in stages, starting with the feeding of the 5,000 in verses 1 to 21, then going on as Jesus and the Jewish leaders dialogue about the meaning of that sign. Before we dive into this week's passage, let me remind you of the Old Testament story that serves as a background to this whole chapter. It's a story of how God fed his people when Moses was leading them through the desert on their long journey to their promised land. There were thousands and thousands of Israelites. And of course the desert is not a good place to find food for even a few people, let alone a huge multitude. So the book of Exodus tells us that the people complained about this to God, and he responded by sending them bread from heaven. They called this bread manna, and they ate it every day for the 40 years that they wandered in the desert. John tells us that when Jesus fed the 5,000 people, they immediately thought of Moses giving their ancestors the supernatural bread in the desert. And they reminded Jesus of this. No, Jesus replied, Moses didn't give it to them. My Father did. And anyway, those who ate that bread all died eventually. But if you eat the true bread of heaven, you will not die. He goes on to explain that he is the bread of life. All who come to him will never be hungry, and all who believe in him will never be thirsty. So far, so good. But in our gospel for today, things get a little bit more confusing. Jesus says in verse 51, I am the living bread that comes down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread I will give you for the life of the world is my flesh. This causes a furious argument amongst Jesus' hearers. How can this man give us his flesh to eat? But Jesus' reply doesn't do anything to alleviate their concerns. Very truly, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. We Christians, of course, have 2,000 years of communion service in our collective memory. So when we hear these words, we immediately think of the bread and wine of Holy Communion. The people who first heard these words from John's Gospel would have thought the same thing. But I'm going to suggest this morning that we slow down. We need to ask ourselves, What would these words have sounded like to those who first heard them spoken? They would have been very confused. What does it really mean to eat Jesus' flesh and drink his blood? And why would we want to do it anyway? What are the benefits that we receive from it? Well, we're told in verse 54 that those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have eternal life. And we need to remind ourselves that the phrase eternal life doesn't just mean life that goes on forever and ever. In a prayer to his Father in John 17 verse 3, Jesus tells us what eternal life is. And this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. To receive eternal life, then, is to be brought into a relationship with the living God and with his Son, Jesus Christ. To put it bluntly, to know God is the only way to be truly alive. What Jesus is saying here, to be physically alive, but not know the God who made you and loved you, is not a real life. It is a kind of walking death. But to meet the God who made you and his Son who died for you, and to grow into a real relationship with that living God, that is real life. If you're looking for the meaning of life, look no further. This is it. Jesus describes this relationship in a very intimate term. He says in verse 56, "Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them." To abide somewhere means to make your home there. And so in this lovely symbolic language, Jesus says to us, if you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you'll be making your home in me, and I'll be making my home in you. I'm sure that some of you can imagine it, because you have begun to experience it for yourselves. Maybe it's not just a constant thing. Maybe you go for long stretches of time when you find it difficult to perceive the presence of God. But there are days when you know that he is very real and close to you as well. And what you experience on those days is enough to spoil you for anything less than this. You know that nothing else in the world can compare with the joy of knowing the living God and his Son Jesus Christ. Once you have tasted of this, you are determined to do what it takes to taste it again and again. In other words, to know God better and better. You sing those words from your heart, as the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. You alone are my heart's desire, and I love and long to worship you. But maybe not all of us feel this way. Maybe some of us can only think to ourselves, I must be missing something here. Maybe some of us have just started out on this Christian life, and we haven't yet really experienced the touch of God in any direct sort of way. Maybe, in fact, some of us have been attending church all our lives and have never really made any personal contact with God. How do we get that? Jesus is quite direct about how we get it. He says we have to eat his flesh and drink his blood. But what does that mean? Lifelong churchgoers are tempted to jump right away to the bread and wine of Holy Communion. But let's not go there too fast. Instead, let's go back to the very first mention of bread of life in John 6 and verse 35. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. In Judaism, there was a long history of seeing the Torah. the Old Testament law of God as the true manna from heaven. It was said that God fed the people with the words of his mouth. So to listen to the law or instruction of God, to think about it and chew on it, and to put it into practice in your life, was seen as a way of receiving the true spiritual bread of life. Jesus is clearly following in the spiritual interpretation of the bread of life here. It is actually a rather audacious claim that he is making. Given the reverence that the Jewish people felt for the law of God, he's claiming to be the embodiment of the Torah. To come to him and to believe in him is to believe that he is who he says he is, to give ourselves to him in faith, to put his words into practice in our daily lives. This coming to him and believing in him, is it a moment of crisis or a gradual process? For many of us, there's probably a gradual process of growing into faith. But it is often has moments of decision attached to it as well. After all, when two people fall in love, it may be a gradual process, but their wedding day is a moment of decision, a moment of commitment, in fact. On that day, they are consciously entrusting their lives and their futures to each other. They aren't just saying, I've fallen in love with you, but I promise to love you for better or for worse, for richer, for poorer, for the rest of our days. Many people experience these moments of decision in their life of faith as well. I know I certainly have. These are the moments when we sense the challenge of the gospel. Will you put your life in the hands of the one who loved you and gave himself to you? Will you follow him and be faithful to him for the rest of your days? How do we respond to that challenge to come to Jesus and to believe in him? A friend of mine used to say that if you understand the invitation that Jesus is giving you, the simplest prayer in the world could be one single word: yes. Jesus is with us this morning and is giving us this invitation. Will you come to me and believe in me? Will you put your life in my hands and let me lead you from this day forward? And if your heart is responding to that call, there is no need to worry about getting the words right. If all you can manage is the word yes, that will be just fine. It's a moment of commitment to Christ. But I also want to say that we renew that commitment every time we receive the bread and wine of Holy Communion. Some of you may be familiar with the old revival preachers and the practice of altar calls. To many lifelong Anglicans, the very thought of an altar call is a shock to the system. But I want to suggest to you that if we understand what we are doing at Holy Communion, we have an altar call every time we have communion in the Anglican Church. Jesus tells us that if we come to him and believe in him, our spiritual hunger and thirst will be satisfied. We respond to that invitation. We get up out of our seats and we hold out our empty hands and ask him to fill them. The emptiness of our hands is a symbol of the emptiness of our lives. Without him, we have no life. But when we come to him in faith, he gives us that life. And so, we receive the bread and wine in faith. And as the Anglican prayer book says, we feed on him in our hearts by faith with thanksgiving. But realize also that this isn't just something we do at communion. It's something we do every day of the week as followers of Christ. Go back to verse 30.